let me start. I mean, are there any among you who were not here yesterday, which is perfectly understandable, just for me to know how much I talk about what I was saying yesterday. So who was not here yesterday? Okay, very few of you, but some. I'll briefly, 5 minutes, just recapitulate what I was talking about yesterday, and then I'll make a short break. And if there are any questions left about yesterday, above all questions you didn't quite understand what I was saying, you use that time, okay? So there are 5 points from yesterday's lecture and seminar that I want to come back to. In the first place, what is this seminar on Marx all about? I mean, what is the perspective, or what are the specific perspectives in which I want to talk about Marx and want to discuss Marx with you? I think there are basically 2 perspectives. They come out of a seminar that I taught at Stanford a year ago, what's left of Marx. So it was not what's left of Marxism, it was what's left of Marx. And as I said yesterday, the pun, the wordplay that is potentially in that question, I mean, namely, what is on the left side of Marx, further on the left than Marx, that was not my intention, that just happened. So it was what's left of Marx, what stays of Marx. Yeah? And there are basically 2 questions to which I would like to come back today at the end. I mean, first of all, what are institutional frameworks, what are concepts, what are arguments, what are values that come out of Marx's work that have survived, that are still with us today, sometimes unrecognized as coming from Marx, but are still there. That is the archaeological question. And the second and more interesting question, of course, is a question of intellectual use value. Yeah? Value not necessarily in the sense of Marx, but what can we do with it? Is there something left from Marxism that is still useful for us today, that might be useful to be recycled today? And there are 2 perspectives of this question. Is there anything that's still useful? I mean, one question is, are there certain concepts, arguments, observations, theories, theoretical configurations that have an analytical value today? I mean, an analytical value today above all to analyze the present. Yeah, that is one question. But this question of the use value also has another perspective, namely, is there any inspirational, motivational power left in the text that we have of Marx, and also in Marxism? So is there something that could motivate us today? And these 2 questions went along with the third point, that tendentially I would like to separate Marx from Marxism. Not necessarily in the sense of saying that Marxism was very evil, was very bad. Marxism was not really what Marx meant, but there is clearly a difference between the work of Marx, I mean, accessible in the original version in the 50 volumes of MEW, Marx Engels Werke. That was the one complete edition edited in East Germany that was finished. And when the implosion of state socialism happened after 1989, there was a second, much more philological edition underway called Mega. But that edition was never finished, and I doubt it will ever be finished as this project. So, you can't try and read Marxist texts as if there had never been Marxism. Yeah? I mean, we normally read it somehow through the glasses, through the perspective of Marxism. And my intention for a fresh reading was that maybe there's something to be rediscovered if we read Marx not through the lens of Marxism. Yeah? And so I will deal, I mean, I dealt yesterday with Marx and with Marxism, but the 2 things are not necessarily synonymous. So that was basically the proposal for yesterday and for today. The second point, is that clear as a proposal? A second point I want to come back to, the first observation, the first thesis that I have, is a tentative answer to the question, what was driving Marx? What was really motivating Marx? I mean, not necessarily in a Freudian sense, but in a sense that would allow for hypothesis that Marx was not completely aware of himself. And as you remember, my main hypothesis was that the driving force in Marx was a desire for justice. Justice, capital J, a desire for justice that probably had to do with the fact that he grew up in pre-national Germany, I mean in a small state in northwestern Germany, and a small town in northwestern Germany, as the son of an assimilated Jewish family. And as an assimilated Jewish family in the age of Restoration, that family, while it continued to be relatively wealthy or well-to-do and successful, they always had to make concessions. I mean, for example, in the year before Marx was born, in 1818, his father had to convert to Lutheranism because that was the condition for him to continue having clients. Yeah? Had he continued to be a Jew, probably he would not have been able to make any money on his profession. Or Marx was a brilliant student, but he never got quite this recognition. And my hypothesis is that this original situation in his life created a motivation for the question of value. What is the true value of a certain type of work? What is my value? I mean, and my hypothesis would be that Marx's passion of value was not synonymous with the insistence of Marxism on equality. You find very few references, if any, in Marx's writings about equality. He talks about equality, but there was never any proposal, let's say, that everybody should have the same income. The obsession was, the lifelong obsession throughout his work, I think, was an obsession with value, with the question, is there an objective value? Not only for proletarian work, I mean, this was his main focus, but also for intellectual work, or for the work of something who organizes industrial production. So the question, is there an objective way to say this is what a certain type of work is worth? So I think this, at least that's my hypothesis, this was Marx's driving motivation. And I think this motivation of justice is different from a motivation of solidarity, you know, where you say, okay, the situation of the workers is very bad and we have to help them. This was, without any doubt, part of what Marx was looking for, but I think he was dominated by this idea of justice. The third remark is about the intellectual environment in which Marx's work emerged. And that is, without any doubt, what I have been trying to describe and to characterize as the historical worldview. The historical worldview, as it began to emerge in the late 18th century, the historical worldview whose most explicit, most complex, most canonical articulation was the work of Hegel. And as everybody knows, I mean, the work of Hegel since his beginnings at Berlin, and Marx went to Berlin at age 17 as a very young student in 1835, this left Hegelianism, this type of Hegelianism that, different from Hegel himself, was claiming that history was not finished yet, that history had to be finished yet. This was the environment which, without any doubt, shaped Marx intellectually. And if you look for something like, if something like that could exist, a common denominator, a historical framework that matters for Marx, and I'm not saying anything new here, but the historical worldview was important for him. I make a distinction between the historical worldview and Hegel. I mean, if you want to understand what that is, the historical worldview, there is no other philosopher who is as important as Hegel. But the historical worldview, as you would say, if I was a French historian, a structure of mentalité is larger, is more flexible than Hegel's work. Yeah? So, I mean, one would say what was the historical framework for Marx is the historical worldview as it emerged. Yeah, this was something fresh then. It was not, but it is for us something that had been institutionalized for several hundred years. It was something new. Hegel was his access to the historical worldview. My fourth observation was that despite this importance of the historical worldview articulated by Hegel as a matrix for Marx's work, there is an epistemological discontinuity in his work that has hardly ever been emphasized. I was mentioning that there was one French Marxist philosopher in the late 60s, early 70s, Louis Althusser, who wrote this book, To Read Capital, I mean to read Marx's work Capital, and he suggested, which was very fashionable then in the 60s and 70s, a structural reading of Marx. A structural reading of Marx, of the Kapital, which he didn't articulate it this way, would be a synchronic reading. Yeah? And my point is that while the first Marx, the Hegelian Marx, was the one who created the theory, the philosophy, the mythology of the class struggle, and that was the part of Marx's work that became mainly institutionalized in Marxism, there is an epistemological discontinuity because the axis of the history of the class struggle is diachronic, is historical, whereas I believe that one could textually prove really that the basic epistemological outline, the epistemological formula of the analysis of Kapital is synchronic. Yeah? So you have this distance, this incompatibility between diachronicity and synchronicity in Marx's work. I'm not necessarily saying that's bad. You could say he was one of the very few intellectuals who was creative in two different paradigms. But it is obvious in Marx's work, in Marx's late work, in the Kapital, that whenever he tried to connect the synchronic analysis of the Kapital with the diachronic axis of the history of the class struggle, he had a hard time. He could never really make this argument. Same is true for Marxism. I mean, Marxism, of course, constantly mentions the Kapital, but it normally mentions the Kapital from a point of view, from a diachronic point of view, from a point of view of class struggle, and not from the point of view of the synchronic analysis. So that is an observation I will come back to today. And finally, I tried to finish yesterday with a preliminary, because we have a second session today, answer to the question. So what's the use value? What is interesting about Marx? Now, let me start with the first Marx, the Marx of the history, the mythology of the class struggle. I would say that historically, it is without any doubt true that this mythology, that this discourse, as one could say in a Foucauldian way, had a considerable motivating power. The certainty that the world will change, the certainty that humans, that classes, social classes, can be the agent of history, had certainly a huge motivating power. For example, a much greater power of motivation than the early socialists, the pre-Marxist early socialists like Proudhon, for example. On the other hand, so this is the ambiguity, I think from a motivational point of view, there was also a negative side to that, because being as Hegelian as he was, Marx, of course, in the history of class struggle, was implying that these developments would happen with historical necessity, that they were unavoidable, that one day one would arrive at a class-free society. And if you're guaranteed that something good will happen, that a class-free society will be the end of history, that this will happen by historical necessity, that takes away your personal motivation. And I actually think, I mean, I didn't live in state socialism, that this was one of the key problems of state socialism. I mean, that the history of the class struggle as a discourse had a very low motivational power for the individual effort. I mean, why would you have to make an individual effort, an individual sacrifice, if the good ending, the positive ending of history was guaranteed anyway? So I think, in that sense, the history of the class struggle has a motivational ambiguity. I personally think that its greatest weakness was that it never really illustrated in a strong way what the positive side, what the beauty, the desirability of the class-free society would be. I mean, a class-free society, of course, would be a society without exploitation, without alienation. But you get my point, it was an image of the end point of history, of the ideal society that was characterized by the absence of negative components of life. But there was not much of a positive component. So what would be so beautiful about this life in a class-free society? And I do think that this was a weakness. As far as the second part of his work, Kapital, Grundrisse, the economic manuscripts are concerned, and I wish we had more time to analyze that, to do detailed textual analysis. It is my impression and my experience, I told you about this experiment we did at Stanford to analyze a phenomenon of present-day American, Californian capitalism economy, that yes, the concepts of the Kapital continue to have considerable analytic power. I wouldn't say all of them, but it is quite astonishing, even in the logic of the Kapital, that Marx was able to imagine certain forms of investment, for example, certain forms of maximizing the capitalistic yield, that we can observe today. So for me, it was a surprise how sharp some of the distinctions that Marx was inventing, really, was imagining, you know, in the 1860s and the 1870s are still today. That is certainly, there are certain categories, I think, worth to be recycled. The weakness of Kapital, and I think it is a weakness that Marx was partly aware of, was the impossibility to have more than the wish that capitalism would come to an ending. Yeah? I mean, Marx himself described capitalism as the Kapital, as the agent of capitalism. Kapital is bound to constantly grow. Marx described with impressive logic how this would happen, how capital would indeed constantly grow, but his attempts to say that capitalism had to fail necessarily were never very powerful. I think this generated this discursive embarrassment in Marxism to constantly predict over 150 years that the actual capitalism was late capitalism. Yeah? So the end of capitalism is imminent, but capitalism continuously survived. Oftentimes, I don't want to justify that, in the most brutal way. But in reality, Marx's attempts to claim with Hegelian necessity the unavoidable ending of capitalism are not very convincing, and I think this has simply to do with the epistemological discontinuity. Yeah? If you analyze a system synchronically, not diachronically, then the question of the future of the system, the question how the system will come to an ending, is an impossible question. You get my point. It is, I'm not saying, and this proves that capitalism will never end. I'm only saying that a systemic approach, a synchronic approach, and Marx didn't know the distinction diachronic, synchronic yet, but it is clearly a synchronic approach, doesn't allow for the question and an answer to the question, how will this system come to an ending? I was saying yesterday, if you analyze language with a Saussurean pattern, I mean language as a system, then you have no way to explain why languages are constantly changing. Yeah, for that, you need a different approach. That doesn't mean that Saussure was stupid or that Saussure's theory is nothing worth. It just means it is very good for certain questions and not so good for other questions. So I think this is more or less, or these were for me the main points of our analysis, or my lecture, and of the questions that we had yesterday. But are there any other questions left for yesterday? My students are always telling me when I'm asking this question, are there questions left? My face shows that I don't want questions. But the truth is, yes, I would welcome questions. Yeah? Mm-hmm. Comment is also good. In Brazil, people always say a doubt. They never say a question. But tem uma dúvida, I have a doubt. So comment.
Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
I have problems with your analysis.
A little bit louder. No?
I have a few problems with your analysis.
Mm-hmm.
We can talk about it. One is, you said that the motivational factor isn't there if it's a sort of historical determinism, that class and society will be the end of history.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, historically, we can say it's actually incorrect because people had immense motivation. I think the one thing that people have had is a motivation in every respect. I think they have failed because historical forces of capitalism have been a lot stronger than the actual motivation of the working class and of all peasants and many other people that rose against capitalism. So I cannot say historically, you really have to find for me evidence to convince me of your statement. Number two, what is the beauty of a class in society? I don't think that has been a problem. I think the fact that we never actually have the power to come into power to actually change the world, to change the class society, not as a class society per se, like in some abstract way, but we look like different in every single place because people are actually making it. Also, you said that weakness of capital is the capitalism becomes a wish. I think it's a very unfair characterization. With all due respect, actually it doesn't wish due to historical forces that are at play, and the fact that capitalism, just like feudalism and many other historical moments, have been moments, and they cannot last forever. And he's saying that, look, internally there's contradiction within capitalism that will destroy not only within itself, but also the actors, which he sees, right? The utopian socialists, Marxist socialists, utopians are just sort of wishful thinkers. They're the wishful thinkers. Marx sees these people are happy. These people emerge. These subjects have emerged and can actually take on this role. So I don't think it's a wishful thing. I think he's analyzing and telling you what's happening and so how it's going to play out. But I don't think that it has not happened. Just because it hasn't happened yet, it won't happen. But of course, we can talk about there's a lot of nuances. But for me, capital, the actual book Capital, and Marx's more methodology is about the notion of capital, where it's going, and not exactly a snapshot of what's actually happening. Because when he talks about capitalism, a lot of things he talks about that doesn't actually occur at that moment, just as this will happen, because of the logic of it, the way it's set up. And so, like, I would have to say that you should maybe be more clear which Marx we're talking about, and also, besides the manifesto, which is a propaganda piece for a specific moment, it's actually very nuanced and especially if you look at notebooks which are reading later, what actually is happening and much more fluid and thoughtful about many things. So we should really try to, the propaganda and the actual writing sometimes can get conflated, maybe, or, you know, we should...
Sure. Well, first of all, many thanks. When people say, oh, good question, I hate that, but this is so condescending. I first evaluate your question, and then I generously try to answer your questions. But I think these are very important points, I mean, for me too. Now, you know, I think about the question about the potential motivational power of certain discourses. I would propose that you and I agree to disagree, because I don't see any way that one could empirically prove what was the actual motivational power of certain discourses. Yeah? I mean, I have my hypothesis, you have your hypothesis, you know, probably your hypothesis and my hypothesis are based on certain types of experience. I mean, my hypothesis biographically is based with having had the, I mean, in a way, privilege as a West German to spend some time in East Germany towards the end of East Germany, 89, when this society was actually, in my impression, not in terribly bad shape, but I would say the actual individual motivation to change something, the way I experienced it, I mean, even among members of the party and so forth, was relatively low. I mean, this was not the most horrible version of state socialism, but I felt it was a very quiet society. At some point, some intellectuals created a document for the party secretary Erich Honecker, congratulating him of presiding the most boring society on the planet. Yeah? So not the horrible, most repressive society, nothing was going on. I mean, that was an impression, I'm not saying that I'm right. Yeah? But I feel there is an ambiguity, not even exclusively in the Marxist discourse, but in any discourse of philosophy of history, in any discourse that implies the dimension of historical necessity, of having motivational power on the one side, encouraging, but on the other hand, at some point, maybe once a different society is established, to say, well, now it will take its course anyway. I'm not saying that I'm right, it's an impression. Maybe you are right, but I don't know. And I don't think this is a question that we can really empirically resolve. Maybe, you know, the nice thing about the seminar is to have these two dimensions for people to think about. Your question about the reading, and where you're saying that I'm unfair with Marx, I completely agree with you on the manifesto. I mean, the manifesto is a beautiful text. The manifesto is a historically important text, but the manifesto is not a very important text, I mean, absolutely not, if you want to analyze and assess and evaluate both historically and systematically Marxism. In the first place, we completely agree on that. Now, also secondly, despite me being a Yankee and having an American passport, I have no intention on earth to claim that capitalism will be eternal. Yeah? I mean, absolutely not. My claim is specifically that with a synchronic paradigm, you are in a bad position or an impossible position to analyze anything about the diachronic development of a paradigm. You can describe, you can analyze this paradigm. I mean, as I've been saying, I think the historical and actual value and analytic power of the Capital is enormous. And I was actually very surprised when I did the seminar. I didn't expect that. It is enormous, but my claim would be it is not a paradigm with which you can predict when something will come to an ending. On the other hand, of course, the philosophy or theory of the class struggle would be capable of doing that, being a diachronic paradigm, only, in my view, the analysis of capitalism, the description of capitalism in the theory of class struggle is very embryonic, is very undercomplex. Yeah? So the problem is, if you analyze capitalism as a phenomenon synchronically, then you will not have a very convincing theory about the ending of capitalism. Of course, I agree with you that capitalism was a strong agent in its own survival is undeniable. Of course, it was. We could also say that if capitalism had, joking, but if capitalism had decided to vanish, said, oh, we really realized that socialism is much better, now we stop being capitalist, that would have been very good for socialism. So, I mean, that there was a tension, and you know, I've really probably more directly than you, I mean, because I'm probably the oldest person in the room, I mean, experienced this tension in the years of the Cold War. You know? I can still remember So when the Soviet Union launched the first Sputnik in '57, I was 9 years old, and you cannot believe what fear and depression that launching of the Sputnik and this incapability of the Americans for more than a year to launch another satellite cost in the West. Yeah? I mean, everybody was thinking this is the beginning of the end of the Western world, of capitalism, because they're technologically so much stronger. I don't know whether anybody knows here this famous kitchen debate between Khrushchev and Nixon. Anybody know that? So this was an exhibit about domestic furniture and technology in Moscow. And the American government had sent the vice president, Nixon was then a vice president there, to represent America. And then all of a sudden, it was not planned, I think, Khrushchev was the party secretary and Nixon met in a futuristic American kitchen. And you get the impression that they both wanted to say that the future was theirs. So Nixon said, look how much we are ahead with kitchens. We are behind with Sputniks, but we are ahead with kitchens. And then Khrushchev was saying that within 20 years, the Soviet Union would produce, I mean, it's a very funny scene, superior kitchens. So there was this tension between the two systems. There was this competition. But to state that, and I will say that capitalism did win the Cold War is not necessarily meant as a triumphant statement. I mean, it just happened. It just so happened. I'm also not claiming it happened with historical necessity. And I will try to finish my answer by saying, if you ask me about a hypothesis for the reason for the implosion of state socialism, yes, of course it was the competition with capitalism, but there was another inherent reason, and that is the vanishing of the historical worldview, not only in the socialist side of the world, but globally. I mean, it is interesting, whenever I'm in Russia, I try to ask people my age and older, what was the time from which on they no longer believed in the final victory of communism, of socialism? And I'm still surprised by how late this is. Yeah, and it did not much depend on the economic weakness or economic development. But it is definitely, that's the convergent answer. They all say it is the so-called period of stagnation. Yeah, the Brezhnev period, the period of stagnation that was, of course, never officially called like that. The impression of stagnation, and my hypothesis would be that this was not so much because of an economic or military or other inferiority, but it depended on the fact that in order to keep socialism alive, you need the conviction that you can shape the future, that you can achieve the future. And it was that framework that was disappearing. Yeah? So I think it was rather this vanishing of the conviction that it is possible to achieve a better society that can maybe historically explain what happened in the late 80s, early 90s. But let me emphasize once again, I definitely have no philosophical, theoretical basis, nor any particular interest in predicting or maintaining or propagating the eternity of capitalism. Yeah, so that's not, I mean, like you, I don't believe that any phenomenon will ever be eternal. Yeah? I mean, that would make me a theologian, and while I'm fascinated by theology, I certainly have no talent for being a theologian. I am what Habermas once called in German, religiös unmusikalisch. So, okay, but thanks for the commentary. Any reactions from you?
Apropos religion.
Apropos religion, yeah. But loudly enough for everybody, because
I mean, it's very, very interesting for me and important.
Can you hear back there? No.
Maybe more.
I don't stand up and
more personally for me, religion criticism in the early Marx works, full with passion and maybe obsession also, ground, or all criticism is critic of religion. And what is your interpretation for his obsession?
Yeah, it's a relatively short historical interpretation. I mean, I profoundly believe that the historical worldview, and with it all this project of socialism, I mean, historically come out of enlightenment. Yeah? And enlightenment, of course, as a movement, begins with a critique of religion. Yeah, there is both, I mean, the two key Enlightenment nations, there is this concept of the conspiracy of the priests. So religion is just the conspiracy of the priests to repress other people, to be dominant in society, and not every Enlightenment philosopher ended up being an atheist, but the critique of religion as a starting point, the critique of any transcendental knowledge, any revealed knowledge, I think is the most elementary gesture intellectually of enlightenment. And in that sense, Marx was clearly an heir of enlightenment. And so I would say there's nothing surprising there. Yeah? That today, intellectually, religion has had a certain comeback. And that today, I think it is more trendy, I don't know about Georgia, for intellectuals to be agnostic than to be atheistic. I would, for example, say that somebody who claims with absolute certainty the inexistence of God, I mean, this is as strange for me as like claiming the existence of God. We definitely don't know. I mean, personally, I don't count with God. But can I prove that there is no God now? Yeah? But 19th century intellectuals, not only Marx, always begin, I mean, you know, much later, and I mean, as different from Marx as we can imagine. It is very important for Nietzsche to say God is tot. Yeah? It's a very different, I mean, a very different argument. But it is also an elementary statement and premise for Nietzsche's philosophy. Yeah? So in that sense, I think this is part of Marx being an heir of enlightenment. Okay, other questions? I mean, I don't want to, it's not like I haven't prepared anything, on the contrary. I've prepared so much that I fear I will not have dinner between finishing the seminar and going on this Aeroflot flight. But, okay, so I take it that these were the questions for the moment and the commentaries. Many, many thanks again to both of you. And as this is our second and last session, if you have any questions or if you feel you cannot follow, please also do interrupt me. Now we know each other a little bit more, and I'm actually moved that the room is full again. I mean, I'm always kind of panicking. Nobody wants to come again after the first session. So thanks for being here again. Okay, I want to start today, and the second part, as we were saying yesterday, is mainly dedicated to reception history. I want to start today with a hypothesis that, in my view, explains why, under present-day conditions, a new institutional reality of socialism, of Marxism, is unlikely. But once again, not because I think that would be horrible, that would be the end of the world, but because I try to argue, I mean, I'm not Fukuyama. Yeah? I mean, Fukuyama was my colleague at Stanford, and whom I find a very intelligent man. Fukuyama has a vested interest for that not to happen. I mean, I don't have much of a political will. Yeah? I try to observe and to analyze things. In that sense, I'm but an intellectual. Okay, and this goes in the following way. I have tried to explain yesterday how what I have described as the historical worldview, remember this description, and I will come back to it, was the historical condition for the emergence of Marx's work and of Marxism. I would say, and there's nothing wrong. I mean, you can say that about any work once you historicize. I mean, Marx's work would have been unthinkable without the context of the historical worldview. Yeah? Proof being that the early socialists, the utopian socialists, are not Marxists. This is a very different framework, I mean a much less complex framework. Now my hypothesis is the following, that while the historical worldview is still institutionalized in certain pockets of what I would claim the global society today. And when I say global, because everybody is using the word and we never know what it is, I'm deliberately not saying global is synonymous with universal. Global does not include all of humankind, but as a working hypothesis, I would say, when I say global, I imply that part of humanity that is potentially connected by electronic communication. I'm not saying that electronic communication shapes the global, but if you are potentially connected to that type of communication, that doesn't depend on whether you have a laptop or not, but if you know people who work on that communication, then you're part of what I call global, which would probably mean with the 7.5 billion humans today, maybe 5 million are part of global, and there are certainly regions in the world that are not global in a sense. North Korea is not global, Cuba is global, so I'm not saying this depends on state socialism. Amazonia, the north of Brazil, is definitely, what Lévi-Strauss described, even today is not global, Madagascar is not global, but I think most of humankind is included when I say global. So, I think in certain dimensions, the historical worldview has survived. I think, for example, in most what we call politics today, because as I was saying yesterday, a post-Enlightenment concept of politics is unthinkable without the assumption of an open future. As soon as you have an electoral campaign, whether it is real or fake, you have to pretend that there's an open future that you can shape. This is where the historical worldview survives. Secondly, a world and institution where the historical worldview is strongly institutionalized is the academic world. Not so much the science world, the technology world, but the humanities world. I do not know of any history department in the world, in the global world, where you can get an MA or a PhD without implicitly agreeing with the historical worldview. Okay, nevertheless, I believe that beginning in the middle of the 20th century, and very slowly, and so to speak metaphorically, behind the back of my generation, as if they had betrayed us, a different worldview has emerged that today is actually dominating our everyday. So when you ask people what is history, then they will answer in a different way, and I will describe this worldview in distinction from the historical worldview. And my argument, of course, will be my initial argument. If the globally dominant worldview today is not the historical worldview, but is rather what I call the worldview of the broad present, this creates, to say that at least, enormous difficulties for any type of socialism, communism, Marxism to articulate itself institutionally. That's my argument. Okay, now here's my description of the worldview of the broad present. And what I would like to invite you is, instead of saying, oh no, he's wrong, history is really our worldview, to do the following fictional reaction. Imagine, so you get up in the morning, you brush your teeth or smoke your first cigarette. I smoke my first cigarette in the morning. And so how does the world appear then? Not in a moment of high reflection, but a premise in the everyday. And my hypothesis is that in those everyday situations, when we do not explicitly think historically, the future for us is no longer an open horizon of possibilities that we can shape, but the future is a horizon that is occupied by threats that come slowly toward us. For example, global warming. For example, the demographic development. I mean, there will be a point when this planet ecologically will not be able to nourish, to feed, to carry 15 billion humans instead of 7.5 billion humans. Or another example would be the exhaustion of resources. I mean, rumor has it that the main reason for the continued existence of NATO, of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, is the prediction that there will be a third world war, the latest in the late 21st century, because of the exhaustion of resources. There will not be enough. So I'm absolutely not in a condition to judge whether these fears are justified or not. I basically and personally believe, yes, they are justified, but that's a different question. I'm only saying that the global future today is much rather occupied by these fears that come towards us than by the hope that we can shape the future. Yeah? There's an interesting example. The first Obama campaign, 8.5 years ago, you all remember the slogan was, "Yes, we can." And yes, we can, I would interpret in the sense of saying there are doubts about the capability of the future to be shaped. There are doubts about our capacity to create the future, but yes, we can. Yeah, and it is interesting that already in the second Obama campaign, 4 years later, there was absolutely no yes, we can. Yeah, Obama had become, in my vision as an American citizen, a very competent crisis manager. Yeah? So I mean, there were always crises coming towards the nation, towards the world, and you take care of that crisis. I don't think that for this reason, this is an age of visionary politicians. Yeah? If you look in Europe, I'm no longer a German citizen, but I think the embodiment of a crisis manager without any vision is Frau Merkel. Yeah? I mean, Frau Merkel has zero vision of anything, but she's a pretty competent crisis manager, and that's why she gets re-elected. Okay, but not that people think about that. I'm saying the future is no longer an open horizon of possibilities from which we can choose, the everyday future. Secondly, the past in that broad present. I mean, in the historical worldview, the past is that dimension that we leave behind us, yeah, and whose orientational value tends to fade the more that we leave it behind ourselves. Maybe you're surprised, but I will say, today, the past, or I prefer to say in English, pastness, is aggressively invading the future. Yeah? Partly due to electronic storage possibilities. There is nothing we can forget. Yeah? We are condemned precisely, partly due to electronic storage possibilities, that everything, in any email that you ever write, I mean, so old-fashioned as the only electronic medium I'm using, any email you ever write will, that's what people are saying, forever remain inscribed somewhere in silicon. Yeah? Also, I mean, as you know, practically every document that is available on the planet is potentially available on the screen of your laptop. That at least is, there's a so-called Stanford Google project, and people are saying that's not a technological problem, but this is just a legal problem. I mean, copyright problem. I also find it interesting, I don't know exactly about Georgia, but I have the impression this is similar, that today there is no single day of the year that is not a commemorative day, yeah, where you could celebrate something that happened in the past. In that sense, that is probably not so strong here. If you look into Central European newspapers today, I mean, every day for the past 2.5 years, there have been documents memorizing the corresponding day during World War I. Yeah, so I think we are completely overfed with the past. To make the past very accessible is no longer the exception. Yeah, I mean, 20, 30 years ago we would say, what is a classic? A classic is the exceptional text from the past that speaks to us as if it would come from the present. My experience with my literature students is that they don't feel that distance anymore. Huh? They feel actually, and I'm not saying they're stupid or they're not sophisticated, they feel Shakespeare talks as directly to them as a 21st century text. I'm not saying they're right or wrong, I'm trying to describe something. Okay? So, we have a future that is blocked, we have a past that invades the present, and I think between that blocked future and that aggressive past, the present today is no longer this imperceptibly short moment of transition, but I think it is an ever-broadening present of simultaneities, in the sense that everything is in the present. Yeah? It is an ever-broadening present of simultaneities, everything is in the present. This present has been described as a field of contingency. I mean, everything is perspectival, you always have to make a judgment, but everything is in the present. So there's no Hegelian necessity in the present. And I'm saying it is an ever-broadening present because I think there's a tendency for concepts of the present to be more and more extensive. I don't know how much this concept of the Anthropocene is being used in Georgia at this point. The Anthropocene would be a concept of the present that says the present reaches from the first negative ecological impact of Homo sapiens on the planet to the vanishing of Homo sapiens from the planet due to this ecological impact. And when the concept came first up 10 years ago, people were saying, well, the first negative ecological impact of Homo sapiens on the planet starts with industrialization. Today the tendency is, it is by definition negative. So ever since Homo sapiens has been existed, the impact is negative. So I get my point, this is the broadest possible present. Yeah, the present is being defined as being co-extensive with the entire extension of humankind. So once again, I'm not saying that's the real present, but I'm saying there is a tendency to have this broadening present. I don't know about Georgia once again, but in the US, for example, it is interesting if you ask people what were incisive changes since 9/11, yeah, since September 11, 2001, a famous day. And then people say, oh, lots of things happened, but they cannot really say something changed. Yeah? I mean, maybe now with the Trump election, God knows whether yes or not, but the feeling is that this present is extending. I mean, this feeling that people described a lot in the 19th and 20th century, that time is accelerating. That is no longer our feeling, I believe. So, now if, and this is number 4, the imperceptibly short present, the present of the historical chronotope, was connected to a human self-reference as a subject in the Cartesian sense, as pure consciousness. Yeah? I mean, the one who shapes the future is a subject, doesn't depend on your body. If that human reference, that thinking about ourselves as consciousness, was connected to the short present, and is our everyday present now is this ever-broadening present, that would explain in the 4th place why, both philosophically and in our everydayness, we have been so obsessed during the past quarter century with reintegrating the body. Intellectually speaking, some of you may know there are these weird disciplines in philosophy today, something like neurophilosophy, N-E-U-R-O philosophy. So integrating what we know about the brain with philosophy. If you ask me, does this have much of a future? I don't think so, but that's not what I'm describing. I'm trying to describe this, I mean, in cultural studies, for example, the reintegration of feelings, the reintegration of the body is a big topic. And I think this is also the case for our everyday. Yeah? I mean, people who are very health conscious, people who are on a diet, people who try to shape their body, people who do jogging in the morning. I mean, my impression is that Georgia is not the number one jogging place in the world. But a country that's more comparable with here than, let's say, California, Northern California, Brazil. I can still remember when I was for the first time in Rio. This was 1966, and I woke up in a beautiful hotel in Copacabana and looked at the beach, and there was nobody. So today, when you wake up in Rio at 6 o'clock and you look at the beach is full of people jogging. Yeah, I mean, in Brazilian Portuguese, you say coopering, but that's the, I mean, so everybody has this obsession with the body, so that is a big change. And finally, I believe that in this worldview, this informal worldview, this worldview that penetrates our everyday, the worldview of the broad present, the past is no longer considered to be a necessary agent of change. Or in other words, we don't feel these trajectories anymore. So this is where the future is going. Yeah, I think this is why among intellectuals, among politicians, it has become much less trendy than it used to be to prognosticate the future. This is going to happen in 50 years from now. I think we are living under a condition that Jean-François Lyotard, the French philosopher of the late 20th century, once characterized, and I think it's a beautiful characterization, as mobilisation générale intransitive, intransitive general mobilization. Yeah? We are constantly agitated, we are constantly doing something, we are constantly feeling that we are lacking time, but whatever we are doing doesn't add up to a trajectory. And by the way, I think the most horrible example for intransitive general mobilization is the new American president. Yeah? Who every day he announces something new. I mean, people say he gets up very early in the White House, then he goes to the bathroom, and then he shoots the first Twitter, and you can never know whether there's any coherence with what he was saying the day before. Yeah? By no means does he feel obliged by what he was saying the day before. By no means is it, because everybody was saying once he gets elected we will see what his project is, what his trajectory is. I think the trajectory of Trump is the complete absence of any trajectory. Yeah? It is intransitive general mobilization. I'm not saying this is why he's the man of the hour, but I want to illustrate what I mean. So my hypothesis, I mean, I hope somehow based on observation, is that this worldview, this temporality of the broad present, is the temporality that dominates our everyday. And once again, don't misunderstand me, I'm not preaching this is beautiful and this is wonderful. I mean, I rather dislike it than like it. Yeah? But I do think that this is really dominating the everyday, and the moments when we think in the historical worldview are exceptional moments, yeah? Are Sunday morning moments. Yeah? Of course, in an electoral campaign, politicians have to say, yes, we will shape the future. We promise you to do this and this and this. But when I was mentioning that yesterday about this function of the open future in democratic politics, you were all looking at me with irony. But who believes that, really, that politicians will shape the future? I assure you that 50 years ago, people tended to believe that. Yeah? And today, I think there's a general skepticism about that, because we say, who is able to change the future? Get my point? If there is something to it, that what I've been trying to describe is the globally dominating worldview. The worldview, not an ideology, it's not an ideology, nobody describes it coherently. It's not a philosophy, it's an attitude, so to speak. Then the possibility to establish something that emerged out of the historical worldview is very unlikely. Is that, you understand that? Let me make this remark, I'm not saying that the historical worldview has disappeared. Yeah, I would rather say it is the logic of the broad present that nothing from the past disappears. Yeah? I mean, everything that was present in the past is being maintained. So the historical worldview is still with us. Yeah? For example, in history departments, For example, in electoral campaigns. For example, when intellectuals discuss about the past, that's still around. You can still use that, and many people understand it. But I doubt that under the conditions of this broad present, a project-oriented ideology, a project-oriented type of politics has much of a chance to be institutionalized. Now I get the impression while I'm talking here as if I was a preacher, and once again, I mean, I'm not the preacher or the ideologue of the broad worldview. You look at me like you say in American English, he has lost it. I mean, what is he talking about? I mean, this would be interesting for me. So is this something that you think, no, this is not your world. Your future is not occupied by threats that come towards you. You can say, okay.
It's a very typical American middle class view. You have a very middle class view. The fact that you think the world starts off with you brushing your teeth, oh, global warming, and this is like, this is middle class. This is not most of America. It's not at all.
The cigarette is untypical though.
Sorry, what?
The cigarette is untypical.
Yes, and I love the fact that you smoke. Seriously, no one smokes in America. But, so, you have these ideas of, oh, no one cares about global warming. They don't care about World War III. These are things that you worry about when you have, like, you already have other things to take care of. Most of the time, again, I work for labor organizations in the United States, I do labor here. People are worried about jobs. They're worried about bread and butter issues. Trump, the fascinating thing about Trump winning was that he said no to that middle class, like, liberal America, because people still cared more about, you know, we don't care if the Keystone Pipeline or whatever is going to ruin the world. We want food now. Like, we want American jobs. We want, so really the bread and butter issues, sorry, bread and butter means like
everyday issues,
are dominant all over the world, and it's resurging because capitalism, the way it's developed, has destroyed really good jobs, and it's impoverished so many parts of the world. It's now over-accumulated. I mean, there's a lot of, I think,
I agree.
Like, there's a Marxist project waiting to happen, is like how I look at it, you know? As in, Marxist methodology for liberation and emancipatory project, because of the way it is. And this, like, and it's fascinating, and I appreciate your worldview, you know, but like...
It's not my worldview, it's a description of something.
I apologize, your sketches are really good. It's more like the middle class fragmentation of the self, you know, it's like, it's that having so many of your needs met, sort of being bored with life and being fragmented, and having so many things like come at you with like, you know, news, and you're just like, you don't know what to do with yourself. Not you, but like yourself.
Well, maybe me too.
And I get also the sort of point of view I think was never there ever. So I think most people it takes a long time for them to even get that point of view. It's a process for them. I don't think it happens organically. I don't think it's natural. You know, it's something that we agents, subjects have to develop, right? And we don't know much about what's going on in the world because, like right now in India, I mean there's like tons of Marxist communists. The half of the state, India, is theirs. I mean,
but it's only one federal state with a communist government.
But the fact that in India is like there's so many strong, like they call themselves communists, but we don't know. We used to say it's communist or not, but like there's so many things happening, so many resurgences at so many different levels that because we don't have a whole picture, maybe it's historical, it's very fragmented. And what we do get access to is a lot of fluff pieces, you know, silly pieces, like pieces of articles and things like that. So I would just say, like, as a Marxist, like, your worldview, I appreciate it, and I think it's true to some level. Thankfully, I think it's not true for most of the world, you know, and I think there's still a chance.
I mean, about the hope or the desirability or the probability of a Marxist project coming, we can again agree to disagree. And I'm saying that respectfully, like you're talking respectfully, so not like, oh, how horrible that would be. I think actually in the description of the everyday, we are not that far apart. See, because for me, the dominant formula that I was using was this, because I happen to like Lyotard probably, I mean this intransitive general mobilization. Yeah? Everybody is doing something. I mean, the bread and butter issues. Yeah? For many, many people, I mean, let's say, you know, most people who go to college in the US with a huge debt, with $100,000 debt. So you start your first job and you make maybe $50,000 per year and you already have this debt. So you constantly are in a mobilization to compensate that. So that, maybe we disagree on that, but to form a project is not what's in your life. Yeah, I mean, whether people think about, I'm not saying, I completely agree with you, not many Americans are ecologists. You can see that, I mean, nobody has ever managed to make ecology a political issue in the US. But if you think about the future at all, then it is normally occupied by negative images. Yeah? It is not a hopeful future. If you say that's a middle class view, that's fine with me, but that would be, I would say it's a global phenomenon. I mean, not everywhere, but what you call middle class is a broadening life condition. Yeah? I mean, as I was teaching this past summer in India, of course you see poverty in India like you never see it in Europe, not even in the US where you see more poverty. And it is an extreme gap there. But the middle class life condition of an Indian colleague, for example, is by or of an Indian college student, is by no means dramatically different from that of a college student, a professor in Europe, or a doctor, and so forth and so forth. So I think there's a broadening middle class that exactly, now take your expression, is so concerned with bread and butter issues every day that they may feel an affinity, not necessarily with Donald Trump, but with that type of politics. With that type of politics that doesn't have any coherence, doesn't have any consequence. Yeah? Just do something every day. That would be my description. So my thesis would be, and that's I think probably very different, that even if I would completely agree with you on the desirability of a Marxist project, which we probably don't, but that's a different question, I would think it is very improbable that under the present day conditions, this could ever develop institutional strength. That's the thesis.
How one can kind of use old European conceptuality, you know, to kind of describe. And of course, it will be always comes this binary opposition to mind. First is the distinction between, let's say, the exhaustion of secularized Christian narrative and return of neo-paganism or paganism, which is very much centered on this, on the present. Second is, of course, far more trivial, let's say, this diagnosis of postmodernity and exhaustion of great modern narratives. And of course, interestingly enough, both of these diagnoses have been made by Lyotard, whom you also quoted. So do you think that any of these kind of either neo-paganist kind of or postmodernist diagnosis somehow describe this broad presence, or you think that it's still kind of something of old conceptuality which should not be applied to this new phenomenon?
Well, there are two answers. I think there is a tendency in the everyday, or a desire really, for new mythologies, and whether they have new forms or not is a different question. See, I think the Anthropocene, I mean, however ecologically meritorious it is a reborn, very old-fashioned, transcendental narrative of punishment. Yeah, there is an original sin of humankind, and that is to not behave in an ecologically correct way. That is, so to speak, the apple of the paradise. And I mean, that people were saying originally, oh, this was industrialization. Now, it is actually, ever since Homo sapiens emerged, Homo sapiens has not behaved in an ecologically correct way. Therefore, one day the punishment will happen and Homo sapiens will disappear from the planet. The funny thing is, while this is a very negative narrative, people love to embrace that, because that at least gives coherence, you know. So there is this type of narrative. There is, as everybody knows, internationally, a huge desire for all different kinds of religion, right? I mean, which I don't have a great sympathy for. But if you go, for example, to South America, it is astonishing what damage, I would say, American sects have done. It is absolutely, absolutely astonishing. But they, I mean, what do? They give a, I think, quite horrible coherent worldview. Coherent worldview, there's a desire for that. And I think there's a desire for that because we're living in this, what I describe as a broad present of simultaneity. Everything is in the present. The present is terribly complex. The present is this bread and butter complex where you feel always behind. Yeah? I mean, what I was saying about paying back college, that is just one example, but you're always behind. I mean, you never have this moment where you say, now I have reached, I mean, this is the moment of redemption. So I think there is a strong desire for such mythologies. I mean, I will not follow this kind of enlightenment impulse and say they're all horrible. But I think, for example, this narrative of the Anthropocene could be described as a new, still secular version of an old Christian narrative, a narrative of original sin and redemption, and ultimate punishment. And what I try to describe precisely, and in that sense, yes, you're right, I'm following Lyotard, who once called himself a symptomatologist of the present. I mean, I try to be that. I try to describe as I can see this present. And once again, I think we have understood each other now. I'm not describing it in the sense, oh, this is my present. It is my description, that's true. So I'm responsible for this description, but I'm by no means saying, this is very wonderful, this is what I want, this is the education, I mean, and so forth and so forth. Yeah, I mean, just to make this very, very clear, I think that this recently elected president of my country is a disaster and an embarrassment. I mean, sometimes it's kind of funny, I mean, unintentionally funny, but I mean, that there be no confusion. Yeah? I mean, very difficult to predict. Yeah, I mean, who could predict what that will be? So, in that sense, maybe I go one step further, is that okay? I mean, in the description. So, to describe this present, yeah, I mean, a more everyday way of describing this present is to say everything is in the present. Yeah, this is why I can agree with you. Most people don't care much about the past or about the future. Everything is in the present. Everything is in the present, and what we care about is this complexity of the present. And people used to describe that. There was a very current, especially in Germany, you will remember that description of the present, to say the present ist ein Feld der Kontingenz, a field of contingency. So most phenomena that present themselves to us don't have the status of necessity, but you have to judge them. There's another Lyotard description. He was saying what used to be the specificity of the aesthetic judgment for Kant has become a general condition of humankind. That's a Lyotard quote from the late 80s. So field of contingency. Why field? When you say it's a field, there's something that's not contingent. I think we used to believe that this present that is contingent was surrounded on the one side by necessities, certain things that were considered not in a Hegelian way as necessary, things we could not change, and on the other side by things that we understood as impossible. So neither the impossible nor the necessary, it's a Luhmann distinction, is contingent. Now my thesis is that we are living in a moment where the present as a field of contingency is morphing, is transforming itself into a universe of contingency, where everything is contingent. Let me give you two examples. Until quite recently, the sex, the body into which you were born, was considered to be necessary in the sense of fate. Yeah? There have always been people, actually, not just in the 20th or 21st century, who were born into a female body and wanted a male body and vice versa, and could also be an androgynous body and you wanted a different body. But this was considered to be fate, you cannot change that. I mean, as you all know, in the age of transsexual surgery, this necessity all of a sudden doesn't appear all that necessary. This is interesting. The best friend of my granddaughter, who's 8 years old, is a little girl who was born with male genitals. And almost since the parents realized that this was not the sex that she wanted, she's been both psychologically and medically in this transformation. And it's actually funny, this happens in a village in the most conservative part of Germany, Bavaria, and everybody's enthusiastic about it. Even the village priest is all in favor, which is nice. Let's go to the other side, to impossibility. So impossibility are things that we can imagine, but we would never attribute to humans. That's what we call impossible. And this is why we would normally attribute those impossibilities to our transcendental imaginations. Omniscience, omnipresence, almightiness. These were all things that we considered to be impossible, and that's why we attributed them to God. And I think the most frequently imagined impossibility was eternal life. Only God has eternal life. And I think you all know that eternal life today has the status of a research project for medicine, for medical research. Whether medicine will ever produce eternal life is a different question. But the status of eternity, eternal life, as impossibility is no longer as strong as it used to be. So the point I want to make is that these examples of the broad present being in a status that goes from field of contingency to universe of contingency produce enormous possibilities, new possibilities of liberty. This is absolutely fantastic. I think this example that my granddaughter is, her best friend, it's moving. Each time that I see that, I think this, so there has been progress during my lifetime, and something like that can happen. At the same time, and this is deliberately not speaking against these things, I feel individually this everyday situation that is a universe of contingency is an overcomplexity from which many, many people suffer. And I will actually say that is a part explanation of what people call the new populism. Meaning that there is a strong desire to have something to hold on to. I think nobody voted. It's, after all, 50% of my fellow citizens, or close to this new president, because he had a program. He has no program. But he produced for people the impression that he was a personality to hold on to. For example, this completely idiotic sentence, "Let's make America great again." That sentence is completely free of content because it's never said what that would be, a new great America. But I think the important element of this sentence is the first person plural. We will make America great again. So this is not me, the politician, so you will be part of something great. Now, under a leadership, what this something great will be, nobody knows. But we together will do something like that. You get my point? So that would be also part of a description of this new present, in which I think projects shaped by the historical worldview have a low possibility of realization. Now, once again, I have no ideological or political interest for this to be true. I try to describe the situation. Okay, now, if this was a text, I would start a new chapter now. And the new chapter would be a chapter of reception history. What was the reception history of Marxism? So to speak, talking about the present and why I believe this is not a good present for a renaissance of Marxism. But if it ever happened, I would not commit suicide, to say the least, okay? It's not, I have no strong thing against it. I don't think it's going to happen, but it's not like I'm going to join an anti-Marxist revival party. No, I won't. Now, what is the reception history? I mean, the reception history, I mean, I tried to talk so far mainly about Marx. Now, the question is, when does Marxism begin? When does Marxism begin? And here, I'm actually referring to a consensus, more or less, both among Marxists and among people who describe Marxism from outside, that Marxism doesn't begin in Marx's own work, but with a text that Engels wrote during Marx's lifetime, and Marx was aware of the text. And the text is the so-called anti-Düring. Anti-Düring. Düring, you don't know the name. It's D-U-Umlaut-Ü-H-R-I-N-G. So I will not spend much time talking about Eugen Düring. I mean, Eugen Düring basically was a German philosopher, ideologue, that you could describe within the 19th century as a positivist, position similar to Kant, for example, in France, who was claiming that he too had an ideology, a political program for the emancipation of the working class. Yeah? So in that sense, Engels considered him a competitor, and Engels wanted to write a text to prove that Marx's theory was superior to that. And it turns out that this text by Engels, that Marx was aware of, but that people didn't pay much attention to while he was writing it, must have been a decisive text for the reception of Marxism in Russia, and I'm deliberately not saying the Soviet Union, in Russia from the 1870s, 1880s on, and in that sense had a strong impact on the development of state Marxism. Yeah? So this anti-Düring text, it's actually an interesting text. I will try to briefly characterize it. But the anti-Düring is very, very important for the reception history. I'm not saying it is the philosophically, stylistically most beautiful text. In general, I think that Engels is underestimated. That's my impression from this seminar. Engels has written interesting things. But the anti-Düring is very, very important for the transformation of Marx's work into Marxism. And once again, Marx knew about it. Sometimes people say it was written after Marx's death. Not true. Marx could have objected it because Engels was absolutely in an authority relationship with Marx. If Marx ever said, I don't want this text, certainly Engels would not have produced it. Now, what is important about this text? So this text was published in 1875 or something like that. I mean, I have it here on my file card, but it's not worth looking up. You can look it up in Wikipedia. So after the publication of the first volume of the Capital, but this text, and this is, I think, the most important thing, clearly privileges the philosophy of the class struggle, the diachronic axis of the work. It, of course, naturally mentions Das Kapital, but it basically, I mean, the description of the position of Marx with which he tries to prove that this is superior to Düring is basically the history of the class struggle. That is the first element that I find important. The second element, and I find this also important, is that Engels insists more than Marx, especially the late Marx ever did, in the scientific character of this reflection. Of course, scientific in the sense that we would never use the word scientific in English, as most of you know. In 19th century, especially in 20th and 21st century, English used scientific only for natural sciences. Yeah? But in German, in Russian, I don't know about Georgian, you use the word scientific for anything academic, so to speak. So Engels insists on the scientific character of the thought of Marx. Scientific in the sense it has an empirical validity, it has a use value, as opposed to the utopian character. Yeah? So utopia, and this is new, I think, compared to Marx, utopia is a negative concept. Yeah? Utopia is that which has to be excluded. So we have the element of the privileging of the theory of the class struggle over the capital of the synchronic analysis. We have the insistence on the scientific character, and as you see with age 69, memory fails sometimes. I will look up, if my glasses allow me, what some other elements are. I will then talk about the style, the specific style in which Engels wrote this document, which is also quite interesting. But the first two elements are history of the class struggle, so the capital gets almost lost, and secondly, the insistence on the scientific character. Thirdly, I think more than the late Marx would do, early Marx did that, there is a strong insistence on concepts like alienation, like exploitation, as that which has to be removed. I mean, once again, I'm not saying this is evil, but the motivational power of exploitation, alienation as that has to be changed. And in that sense, the political character is strongly emphasized by Engels. What is also strongly emphasized by Engels is what we call dialectics, namely that what will propel history is the tensions between different classes. Yeah? The tensions between different classes, says Engels, is what produces the energy of history which will lead us towards a class-free society. What I personally, and this may have to do with the fact that I'm originally a literary scholar, a literary historian, find interesting, is that the style of the anti-Düring is very different from Marx's prose style. And in my view, some of you have more experience with that, much more similar to the style of Marxism, also state Marxism. And I want to describe three details, and once again it would be beautiful to have an entire seminar session to illustrate that, but we just don't have that time. Let me describe you three stylistic observations that I think are mine, but it doesn't really matter. I mean, I've never read that somewhere. So what is typical for Engels, and what I thought was very typical for the style, for the discourse of state Marxism, were inversions. Yeah, Marx has one very famous inversion, and that is the inversion of turning Hegel upside down. Yeah? Turning Hegel, who stands on his head, upside down so he can stand on his feet. And you find an endless number of such inversions, this rhetorical form of inversion. In Engels, for example, he says, the agents should determine the products, but in capitalism, products determine agents. Yeah? So that is just one example, and I feel these inversions. You see, this is, in reality, this is a scandal. Yeah? Agents determining products is how the world should be, but in capitalism it's just the other way around. So this stylistic form of inversion, I think, is very typical for Engels, and in my experience, but I've never really lived under state socialism, it was typical for state socialism. Secondly, there is a stylistic figure that I would call epiphanic. So things all of a sudden appear. Yeah? I mean, there's a figure in the discourse of Marxism that says, you thought things are very complex. In reality, they are very simple. To give you, I mean, Engels does that quite a lot. For me, the key position is people thought that politics is a multi-causal procedure, depends on many factors. In reality, it only depends on economy. Yeah? And this in reality, so this eye-opening, in reality it is much more simple than you thought. Or there is a rhetorical formula that Engels uses all the time in German, nichts als. This phenomenon is nothing but. Yeah? So describe something very complex, and this is nothing but an effect of capitalism.
Reductionism.
Huh?
So reductionism.
Yeah, I didn't want to call it reductionism because I wanted to describe it rhetorically, but that's what it rhetorically is. I mean, it has a certain rhetorical power, because you always produce these eye-opening moments. Oh my God, I've never seen things this way. Now I realize that you just turn Hegel upside down, and it all functions, right? So, I mean, There's these inversions, there is this epiphanic effect, and then thirdly, and very important, and that is not very strongly in Marx, and I think it's very, very important, A, for the reception history of Marxism, and B, for the motivating power in that sense. Engels constantly says the development towards the better has already begun. Marx says this very little. So we can already see the first symptoms of the turning around of history having begun. Yeah? It will be a long way towards the class-free society. Marx normally tended to say it's a very short way. It's a long way, but it has already begun. And it will now hold with necessity. Yeah? So what I've been doing here was not necessary to say that Engels was evil or he was falsifying Marx. Of course, each reception is a subjective reception. I think something like an objective reception doesn't exist. But I do think, and I do have the impression that the anti-Dühring in Engels' style is very, very important to understand the reception history of Marxism. Once again, not that I say he betrayed Marx and that's not the real Marx, but that was a strong condition. So, I mean, that was purely descriptive. If we had much time, but not too many of you have grown up under state socialism, I would actually like to ask you whether you share this impression that some of these elements of Engels' rhetoric were part of the state Marxist discourse, but that will happen in my next life or during my next visit to Tbilisi. Next step, I would like to describe as a specific form of reception, not as the only form of reception, the way that state socialism, state communism, I'm not only referring to the Soviet Union, but the Soviet Union being the first state that constituted itself with a Marxist program, what was the way in which state socialism, state communism, was using the work of Marx and Engels actually. I mean, it was always Marx and Engels together. And yes, in this case, I will use theological concepts, once again, not in order to accuse anybody, but because I think that there's a very strong similarity with the way the Catholic Church, I don't know about the Orthodox Church, but the Catholic Church has been using the gospel. Yeah? And I will give you 4 features in which I think there are interesting parallels. So this is, I mean, basically how did state communism administer this work, administer this text? In the first place, and I think this is very, very important, there was a rhetorical gesture to dehistoricize this text. Yeah? So this is a text that talks to all of humankind. This is a text who talks to all of humankind independently of the historical situation, independently of the place. So this is giving this text a transcendental status. Yeah? I mean, actually, I'm not saying this is only the Catholic Church and Marxism which did that. We do that constantly in the humanities when people are saying sentences like, what did Jacques Derrida want to say us? And I always insist, in the first place, he didn't want to say us anything because he wasn't thinking of us. No, but you get my point. I mean, this formula, us, implies a non-historicity of the text and a transcendental character of this text. Yeah? And I think in this sense, it was understood that the MEW and the Mega, I mean the original text of Marx, had a certain transcendental status. Yeah? Transcendental not in the sense of religion, that was not the intention, but independently of place, independently of social context. Yeah? You would say this text is as important for India as it was for Central Europe, as it will be for South America and so forth. So So that is a first characteristic. A second characteristic, and I think this is also very important, is philological. In the literal sense of philology. The preservation, I mean, there was an enormous effort invested in the preservation of the original text. Yeah? The sheer fact that after the edition of the 50 volumes of MEW, I mean the German original of the works of Marx and Engels, and I happen to, you would be astonished if you come into my house, the first books you see to the left are the 50 volumes in blue leather of the MEW. I think it is a very good edition by philological standards. But as I was saying before, I mean, in 1989, 1990, there was another project underway. And what I find also very interesting is that an enormous effort, even in the Soviet Union, was invested in the original German text. Yeah, I mean, yes, of course there are translations and the translation matters, but it is extremely important to secure the original text. Yeah? I mean, actually in that case, I would say as an emphasis on the original text that's rather comparable to Islam. You know that. I mean, from a theological point of view in Islam, only the Quran with vowels is the real Quran. Yeah? If you write the Quran text without vowels, it is no longer the Quran. And also a translation of the Quran is not the Quran. So, I mean, I'm not saying it was exactly the same, but the insistence on the German text, the philological insistence, the idea to really secure what Marx had written, I'm not saying necessarily for ideological interest, but secure everything that Marx had ever written, including letters, was very philological, and again, I mean, had something similar to religious institutions. Thirdly, and that is the more politically interesting fact, there was a strong attempt by state socialism to control the interpretation, to control the hermeneutics of the reading of the text. Yeah? I mean, the concept that most of you know, revisionist text. Yeah? This was very typical for that because revisionist text were texts that were excluded from the canon. So a revisionist text was included by state Marxism from the canon. I think the most interesting historical character among Marxists and readers, and very competent readers of Marx in that sense, was Georg Lukács. Because there were several moments in Georg Lukács' life when the central institution of state Marxism in the Soviet Union excluded Lukács' readings and Lukács' hermeneutics. For example, when in the early 1920s Lukács was claiming that the working class, meaning proletarian readers, actual proletarian readers, should have a greater saying, a greater agency in the interpretation of Marx's and Engels' works. Yeah? This was rejected, and Lukács never came back to this point. So I'm not saying that the state Marxism was just institutionalizing one reading, but I do think there was always a certain scope of reading. Yeah? You can read from here to here. There's a certain plurality of readings, but certain things were always excluded. And I find the word revisionist interesting, because what does revisionist mean? Revisionist basically means this is a text that is not faithful to the original. Yeah, there was this very strong belief that the original text had one and only one authentic meaning, and that it was the party in its ideological institutions, of course the imagination was, would not control the meaning, but would administer the meaning, would guarantee that this meaning was truly maintained and that no other meaning was ever institutionalized. So I think these elements of state Marxism were actually, I mean, these elements of the reading were actually characteristic, and now I've even lost my glasses and I cannot find the fourth element. Do you have glasses? No, I have my glasses. The glasses were hidden under the cigarettes. See, that's what happens. Well, the fourth point is kind of I mean, I would say that there was a strong insistence on what I would call a dogma. And by dogma, once again, I do not mean necessarily something very evil, that's coherence. Yeah? I mean, there's an effort to make things coherent. And I think partly this is where the tension between the early Marx and the late Marx disappeared. Yeah? I remember, for example, there was the one state socialist country that I knew relatively well, that in East Germany intellectuals would always make a difference between the early Marx and the late Marx. And they would always like the early Marx more than the late Marx, but you could never publish that. You could not play out the early Marx against the late Marx. So Marx had to be coherent, and Engels, or you could not have said the anti-Dühring shapes Marx in a certain way. Yeah? Not because the anti-Dühring had a bad intention, but because it was a specific reading of Marx. So I think there was an insistence on coherence. So I think this was a description of one reality of Marxism, but of course this is not the entire reception history of Marxism. I mean, I think Marxism as state Marxism is one type, one part of the reception history. Third part of what I have to say today is precisely the different revisionist Marxisms. And of course, as you all know, there is an infinity of revisionist Marxisms, of interpretations of readings of Marx outside state socialism. And instead of characterizing them all, which would be impossible, I try to mention a number of features that they share. I think as a first feature there is a tendency in revisionist Marxism to not accentuate the scientific character. Yeah, I mean, that Engels would so strongly emphasize. It is interesting, I think, the main contribution of Habermas, of Jürgen Habermas, for example, to revisionist Marxism was the insistence that the truth concept in the interpretation of Marx's work was a truth concept based on consensus. Yeah? I mean, so if many people agree with a reading that we are proposing, not necessarily that I, Habermas, am proposing, then this will be a good reading and a politically efficient reading. You get my point? I think as a tendency, revisionist Marxism took out this kind of transcendental option. There must be a one and only true meaning, a substantial true meaning in the text. I think that is one element. A second element, and I think this is not only typical for the so-called Frankfurt School, Horkheimer, Adorno, Habermas, and so forth, but also typical for other revisionist positions, for example, Slavoj Žižek. I don't know whether at this point he wants to be a Marxist or not, but there were moments in his life where he wanted to be a Marxist. That is the integration of Freudian theory into Marxism. Yeah, the integration of Freudian theory into Marxism, if you ask me, what has most characterized the so-called Frankfurt School from Adorno and Horkheimer on, and if you want to include Benjamin in the Frankfurt School, it would also be true for Benjamin, which is, I think it's complicated to include in the Frankfurt School, but that's a different question. To include Freudian elements in an epistemologically problematic way, I'm not saying illegitimate way, because clearly the Freudian concepts were concepts developed out of and in intention to improve individual psychoanalysis. So they were concepts applied to individual life, to individual behavior, to the individual psyche, and within a Frankfurt School context, they are normally used to explain collective procedures. Yeah, I mean, this would be another interesting seminar, whether this is legitimate or not, but this becomes a different Freudianism. And there is a tendency there to transform situations of suffering, for example, situations of alienation, situations of exploitation, in the sense of a psychoanalytic loop, as if there was a therapy into situations of insight. Yeah? So if you are suffering in this social situation, that tells you something objective about your situation in society. Like in psychoanalysis, if you constantly bite your fingernails, that must have to do something with a problem you have with your father, or God knows, with your sex, or with the weather, or whatever. Yeah? But I mean, the status of these classical concepts of Marxism, alienation, exploitation, and so forth, the negative concepts, is a different concept. They become symptoms for a type of psychoanalytic insight. Thirdly, and here I'm referring above all to Ludwig Marcuse. I mean, a Marxist belonging to the Frankfurt School, was enormously popular in the 1960s, when I was the age that most of you are. This is also an integration of Freud, but in a different way. Herbert Marcuse. Herbert Marcuse, not Ludwig Marcuse. Herbert Marcuse, and this is the concept of the pleasure principle. Yeah, I mean, it was a surprise for me. We recently read, actually, Marcuse in the philosophical reading group. I mean, if I have ever read a Marxist theorist, a Marxist philosopher, well, I thought, oh, here's an interesting potential for a desirable, attractive description of the class-free society. It was actually Marcuse. Yeah? Strongly based on erotic categories, but that is very desirable. Yeah, and I think there's a certain imagination. What is that so funny, what I'm saying? No. Okay. But if so, tell me. Okay, so the point I wanted to make is that Marcuse basically tries to illustrate the concept of class-free society. Yeah? Okay, so that is part of revisionist Marxism. Marcuse, for example, was one of the authors that nobody was allowed to read under state socialism. Yeah, I don't know about the Soviet Union, I think it's unlikely, but definitely not in East Germany. The limit was Habermas. Habermas was forbidden for a long time. In the last 10 years, actually, there were several books by Habermas were available in the German Democratic Republic. And then finally, and I find this is interesting, and I will just give you one example, what I think makes revisionist Marxism, and revisionist is a negative concept, I'm not criticizing revisionist Marxism, interesting is that, of course, different from state Marxism, that has to be transcendental. Yeah? The original text is transcendental, it speaks to all times, to us, to all institutions, that revisionist Marxism has an openness to react to changing historical situations. And I want to give you one example because I assume that most of you, if you're interested in this topic, are familiar with the text. Although, once again, the question of whether this author was a Marxist and wanted to be a Marxist is a problematic question. I'm referring to Benjamin. Biographically speaking, it is very clear that ever since he fell in love with Asia Latzis, who was a Soviet pedagogue, as you know, she officially didn't call herself a pedagogue, but an engineer of education, which is very moving. This was the 1920s language, not only in the Soviet Union. He declared that he wanted to be a Marxist. I'm referring to the last text that Benjamin wrote, the thesis on history. Now, this text, and few people think about it, is very interesting in the sense of the intersection of the historical situation with Benjamin's biographical situation. Because, I mean, as you all know, Benjamin was a German Jewish intellectual, regardless of whether he was a Marxist or not, was always on the left. So he had two reasons to leave Germany in 1933, actually he never left Germany. He happened to be on a vacation in Ibiza, which then was not so much a vacation resort as now, and just didn't return to Germany. Same story as Thomas Mann. So Benjamin lived in France, a very poor, very precarious life, And it was during those years in the 1930s that Benjamin increasingly was, I mean, I think he became increasingly well-read in Marx. Let me put it this way. So that means that in the 1930s, in this high age of ideological tension, I mean, this was the competition in the 1930s is, of course, communism, the Soviet Union, and fascism expanding. I mean, in Italy, in Germany, and in more countries, in a time where fascism could have taken over in many other countries where it never happened. There was a very strong fascist American party, for example, in those days. So Benjamin, of course, clearly opts for Marxism, right? Opts for the Soviet Union. And what then happens, and I think this is normally underestimated in the readings of the thesis on history, what then happens is the very famous Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the pact between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. And when Benjamin dies and commits suicide, this pact is still existent. So Benjamin never knew during his lifetime that at some point Nazi Germany would attack the Soviet Union would win World War II. Yeah? Benjamin died, and I'm using my terminology about the open future, with an open future that no longer existed. And the open future for Benjamin had been the socialist future. And you opt for communism, you opt for Marxism, that is the future. But in the moment, you get my point, in the moment that there is a pact between Nazism and communism, there is no open future left for Benjamin. I mean, biographically speaking, this is not. This, I think, is the precondition for a historical and I feel an interesting reading of this text. Yeah, if you know the text, you know there is this strange figure of the angel of history. Yeah, the angel of history, which actually goes back to this design by Paul Klee that Benjamin possessed. So Paul Klee was not very expensive at this point. That for some strange reason today is actually in the Museum of Modern Art in San Francisco. I mean, can't tell you what the reason is, but so it's very close to. I mean, this copy, Benjamin. There were many of those angels, but this copy is now in California. So the image, the central image of the thesis on history is precisely that the angel of history does not turn towards the future. He turns his back towards the future. Right? He turns his back towards the future. And where's the angel of history looking? The angel of history is not looking towards the future, but the angel of history is looking towards the past. The angel of history is looking towards the history of those who have been defeated. Now, Benjamin doesn't say that explicitly, but I believe that the idea behind this look back into the past is that out of a solidarity, out of an identification with those who have been defeated, with an identification with the suffering of the past, you can still get an energy that will bring you into the future, even if the future is closed. Because the end of the metaphor is that this angel is not only looking back into the past and is turning his or her back to the future, but there is a wind blowing from the past that moves this angel. Okay? I have to admit that in general I'm not the greatest Benjamin fan. I mean, without any doubt, Benjamin is a super important 20th century intellectual. I mean, I don't take him as religiously as some other readers, Agamben, for example, take him. But I feel this text in particular is a very powerful text and a very beautiful example of reception history. Yeah? I mean, the coordinates of this image clearly come out of the Marxist version of the history of the class struggle. Yeah? I mean, you're motivated by knowing the past to go towards the future. But in this situation, the future is closed, and the way that Benjamin metaphorically changes the situation is, I think, very powerful. I want to give you one other example. Most of you also know this text. an example of a revisionist Marxist position being open for historical circumstances. And that is this famous text by Horkheimer and Adorno, Dialectics of Enlightenment. Dialectics of Enlightenment. The question that Adorno and Horkheimer are asking is a question that I think would have been problematic within Orthodox Marxism. It is the question that how can one explain that fascism, Nazism could emerge in one of the Central European cultures of enlightenment. I mean, I personally would be more pessimistic about the association between German culture of enlightenment historically, but that's a different question. Yeah, and the answer is actually the answer about dialectics of enlightenment, namely the answer, but by emphasizing unilaterally rationality, enlightenment has abandoned the sensual, the perceptive, the emotional side of life, and precisely by unilaterally privileging rationality, it has facilitated a way of dealing with other humans that is purely numerical. Yeah? And the example is the numbers tattooed in the forearms of people who are in concentration camps. Yeah? This once again, I mean, this emphasis of a lack of emotionality is not something for which you find a pattern, for which you find a basis in Marxism, but I think it is a productive and important addition. For me, this is clearly one of the very important Western contributions to 20th century intellectual life. I mean, for me personally, it is a text without which I hardly imagine my own intellectual life. I mean, not that I read it every month, but it's a very important and very foundational text. So, okay, I stop here, I hit the brake, not only because it is late. What would then be finally the evaluation? I think, I mean, we don't have to go through the whole list of evaluations that I have. It is very clear that there are remnants institutionally. There are certain states that until the present day declare that they are state Marxist, and they're very different. I think the People's Republic of China is endlessly different from North Korea, is endlessly different from Cuba. That exists, everybody knows it. There is a zone of left-wing parties that declare more or less that they're Marxist or not. Some try to emphasize it, others try to avoid it. I think that is very obvious. I would like to end with a strange question that occurred to me in the seminar. I mean, in the seminar I was doing a year ago. And this strange question of imagination was the following. So, I mean, this is of course a metaphor. If Karl Marx resurrected from his grave in Highgate in London, which is actually easily accessible today, if he resurrected today and would live first in post-Brexit UK and then in EU Europe, and I'm not saying the United States, would he think that is a good enough society, or would he think that is a society that still needs revolution? I mean, if my argument is right, that there is no evidence textually that Marx was insisting on any radical form of economic equality, then you could say that the predominant model of social democracy in the EU might be the type of life that Marx would have imagined. I mean, I have no specific political interest in saying, see, and the EU and European societies are what Marx was imagining. I mean, for some reason I'm not living in Europe. But nevertheless, I think this is an interesting question. I mean, this is an interesting question for me because I do not think that there's any guarantee that what became state Marxism is closer to Marx's own vision than what became this type of generalized social democratic living. Once again, this is not without the intention to say, and this is because it is wonderful, this is because it is good. It is a historical question. I didn't know that I had spoken for that long. I really, first of all, want to thank you for your attention, and ask the rector and president how much time. We still have no time.
5 minutes maximum, because we'll be late for the next
5 minutes maximum. That means there has to be a brilliant question. Yeah, and if you give me one question, then I can leave the building with the feeling that I haven't killed you all. Such a long discourse. Okay, then I hope I can still come back. I do hope that I've given you some food for thought to think through what the status of Marx could be under present-day conditions, because while I was speaking in a very historical way, the idea was really, in a certain degree, to get a perspective on what one can possibly do with this work, important work today, not only in the sense of historicizing it and saying this was one of the great thinkers of the 19th century, and that would be Foucault, who said he's swimming in the 19th century like a fish in the water, but also with the potential of having a certain motivation power and a certain analytic power today. Okay, so I thank you very much.